Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing? It's a beautiful, warm evening. I don't know when the weather is going to change, but we're looking forward soon. Good evening. Welcome to the Armenian Studies Program lecture series. And today I'd like to start off by looking at our upcoming events. As you see, we scroll through these, and we have 3 events coming up in October, beginning with our next, which is October the 4th. You'll see it come up, which is going to be a beautiful and wonderful Armenian Film Festival. 6 short Armenian films, which will be shown as part of the Cineculture series, which is going to be in the other piece. It's not going to be here. It's going to be in the rec center at the Save Mart Center, West End. If you're interested in more details, I'll send that to you. But it'll be at 5:30 p.m. It's free. We're going to look at 6 different short films, none longer than 15 minutes. So they're all short films, all different themes, and produced and made by Armenian directors from all over the world. And at the end of that, we'll have a chance to do some discussion with 1 or 2 of the directors. This was an event we started in the spring, and it was really successful, so we're going to continue it. And I was on the committee that helped to choose the films, and I think they're going to be really wonderful films. Now tonight, we're going to have as our speaker Dr. Simon Maghakyan, who is the Kazan Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies. The Kazan Visiting Professorship was established about 20 years ago through an endowment from the Kazan family. And the first professor in that series was Dr. Richard Hovhannisyan. And today we're going to have Dr. Maghakyan speak, and he's the 20th in that series. And the reason I'm mentioning him now is because he's speaking tonight, but in just 2 more weeks, he's going to give the second in a 3-part series of lectures. So you're here for the first part of the lecture, so you have to come back for the second and the third part because there's going to be more to complete it. And I'm going to tell you that I'm looking forward myself to this because it's a very interesting topic, and he's someone that is very versed in that topic, and I'll speak more about it. And then we've talked about our visiting professor in Armenian Studies, David Zakarian. He's over here. Just wave your hand again, David Zakarian. Dr. Zakarian, let's have a round of applause to welcome him. I won't introduce him at every lecture, but this is his first semester at Fresno State, and he will be a new permanent part of our program. And he's coming from the University of Oxford, where he has particularly studied the issue of Armenian women in literature and in history. And as it comes up in just a moment, you're going to see that on October the 17th, it's a Thursday night, Dr. Zakarian will talk about the portrayal of women in early Armenian literature. So we have a lineup of the next 3 weeks. I know it's on Fridays, most of them, and on Thursday, but these are going to be something that's going to be very interesting. I also want to introduce and remind you, as you go out, that this year, is 2025, marks the 4th anniversary of what is called Keftime Fresno, and that is the Keftime Legacy Band, which has Andrew Hagopian and Philip Hagopian. So where's Andrew? Is he here? It's outside on the phone probably, and then Philip is here in the back. This is going to sell out on October the 1st. If you want to go to this, it opens up online October the 1st, and you purchase your tickets. It's January 25th, 2005. We get over 350 people. It's going to sell out in like hours, so you have to get onto the portal if you're interested in coming for dinner. You can come just for the dance. You can do that later, but if you want to come for dinner, it's called Keftime Fresno 4, and only, again, 350 tickets are available. If you're interested, get one of these flyers and take it with you. And then also I want to introduce again our students. We have many of our students here tonight, and they are selling our ASO, Armenian Students Organization, t-shirts with the Armenian Studies or Armenian students on the front, and then on the back. This was last year's t-shirt, but it's something that's really, I think, quite nice. It has a pomegranate tree with roots and Armenian theme to it. If you're interested in this after our lecture, come on outside, and when you're having coffee and desserts, you can purchase some of these for your family members because they're really quite nice for that. So want you to support that as well. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over before I introduce Dr. Maghakyan. So tonight our presentation is going to address the question of the Ottoman Empires and the pre-Erdogan Turkish Republic's Approaches to Armenian Cultural Heritage. So this is really the topic for the next 3 lectures. It's about Armenia's cultural heritage and how that is addressed by a variety of agents and players in the world. Tonight, Dr. Maghakyan is going to introduce how in the historical part of the picture, and it's going to highlight the mixed record of destruction, dispossession, and accommodation. So we're going to see a lot about Armenian monuments, churches. I won't tell you more, and he's going to tell you more about it. But it's my great pleasure to introduce and to tell you a little bit about the background of our speaker, Dr. Simon Maghakyan. As I mentioned, he's the 20th Kazan Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies at Fresno State. He's a community scholar at the University of Denver's Korbel School of International Studies, and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford. He just recently completed his doctorate degree from Cranfield University in Defense and Security, focusing on heritage crime. Let's have a round of applause congratulating him. He just completed that doctorate. And he has a lot of experience, and he writes a lot. So if you're looking about this topic of Armenian cultural heritage, you can find it in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Time Magazine, and also he's been on BBC and a variety of other public forums. And I've had the pleasure to work with him on a couple of committees with the Western Diocese dealing with Artsakh and the cultural heritage of Artsakh. And he has a forthcoming book as well called Sovereign Heritage Crime, Security, Autocracy, and the Material Past, which will be published very soon through Cambridge University Press. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. Simon Maghakyan. Dr.
Thank you, Professor Maghakyan. Thank you, Fresno State students, community members, faculty. Today's topic is the past of Ottoman Armenians or Western Armenians, a community that lived their ancestral lands for several thousand years and continuing there despite occupation, destruction, and forced conversion. But tonight also marks an important anniversary for Armenians, and we'll talk about that a little later. But I want to start with this photograph. And I want us to try to see what's going on there. Obviously, there are dancers in traditional attire, men, women, and some children. If you look down under where it says Turkey, you might spot 2 priests. So this is at an Armenian monastery. In fact, the most important Armenian monastery in Western Armenian civilization, Mesho Surkarapet. It was so important that locals and pilgrims throughout the Armenian world called it Sultan. So only second to God, Mesho Sultan Surkarapet. And the tradition of revering this church, praying to it, has continued to this day, including in the Armenian diaspora and in the Republic of Armenia. There is a saying passed along, Mesho Sultan Surkarapet Zezlini Bahapane, the Sultan of Mush, Saint Karapet, which means Holy Precursor. It's a name for John the Baptist, be a guardian for you all. And this is an image that's tied to the anniversary today, but it's also tied to that song. One of the many soldiers who fell defending Nagorno-Karabakh, starting exactly today 4 years ago when Azerbaijan attacked that region. And this fallen soldier had left a note for the family, well maybe for him, but the family found a note, and in there, in his pocket, it said, Mesho Sultan Surkarapet, Toglinizas Baba. We're going to look at the historical landscape of Armenian churches, sacred sites throughout what is now Turkey. We're going to discuss heritage, what that means to the people who left it behind, and what the future might entail. Of course, a lot more about that in the upcoming 2 lectures. The question of heritage is important, and there is a growing field called critical heritage studies. This started in about 1986 with the publication of The Past is a Foreign Country by David Lowenthal, and he challenged the way we interact with the past, how some memories are created and even invented. This was a time when the topic of imagined communities or nationalism, as you may be familiar with other titles, was very very current. And in the 90s, there was a lot of literature on nationalism and archaeology, and an important book that I'll have in one of the slides by Laura Jane Smith called Uses of Heritage that explains the different meaning of heritage. First, she challenges the European concept of monumentality, that is, the buildings being heritage, and incorporates various ways of thinking of heritage, including intangible heritage such as language, songs, and traditions. But most importantly, she talks about heritage as a verb, a process. Another scholar at the University of Texas, Stephanie Mulder, she has made it even simpler. She says heritage is what makes people's lives meaningful. I asked the question to my students, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But before that, a very quick overview of why heritage is targeted in conflict. And we know probably the most obvious answer is demoralization, hit where it hurts. But there's other parts of it, including the plunder, so the economic opportunities, and securitization, which is another school of thought in the 90s that argues that identity can be constructed or thought to be an existential threat. The Ottoman Empire, which later became the Republic of Turkey, is part of, has a history that's mixed. Obviously, we're all familiar with the Armenian Genocide and some of the destruction that took place. We'll review that. But there was also destruction prior to that in 1909 during the Adana massacre and in 1895 during the massacres. And of course, a lot of the destruction is happening today. It continues today through looting, and we'll be talking more about that in upcoming lectures. On my very first day of class here at the university, I asked my students, what is heritage? Before we talked about literature, theory, and all that. And these are the answers that they came up with. Number one answer was culture. But we also had answers of history, family, identity, symbols, and specific places. And then, when we were reading Laura Jane Smith having the conversation, one of the students noted something important. That heritage is the collective memory. In other words, we can talk a bit about it as the material past. And memories have had different manifestations in the Armenian life, and there are different types of heritage. We already mentioned intangible, but there's also the tangible heritage, including a carpet that was split during the Armenian Genocide, given to two daughters who finally met each other in the United States a decade later. Or the 60-pound copper tray that was carried on someone's back as an object that was important to them and to their community. Or show Jarantij, the Homilies of Mush, the largest Armenian manuscript from the 13th century, preserved at Maghakyan. These are all examples of cultural properties. And if you're interested in learning more about movable objects that were confiscated or destroyed during the Armenian Genocide, many of you are familiar with Hemlar Wattenpa's monumental work, The Missing Pages. I want to acknowledge my own connection to this subject, and it is the city of Urfa or Yedesya in what is now Turkey. So on the left is a photo of the altar of the largest cathedral in that town. It was destroyed during the Hamidian curse and again during the Armenian Genocide. In 1994, a prominent author witnessed the conversion of it to a mosque. And then 10 years after that, which is 10 years ago, I happened to be the first person in my family to visit the area. 6 months earlier, I'd been another terrain, which is my main research subject area, the Javan region, which is now in Azerbaijan. I'm not allowed to go there. No Armenian is. But I was able to see part of it from the Iranian borders, using not my American, but my Armenian passport. And there, I saw nothing left of what used to be the world's largest medieval Armenian center, a state-sponsored eradication that some believe mimics Turkey, especially if we think of some of the cases of total destruction, like in Van or in Arbet. But it's not all the same. Because there are certain remnants and certain functioning churches of the Armenian heritage in Turkey. So we want to talk about the different ways that Armenian churches and the material past have been treated. But this is not just a story about one culture. We know that culture has been targeted in conflicts, whether hot or cold, including in the Balkans in the 90s, the early 2000s, in Afghanistan, in Mali later, by ISIS, and we have examples from Nakhchivan and outside as well. Culture is targeted, and we have seen records throughout history. There's one from an Assyrian king describing the destruction of an Urartian temple. And he takes pleasure in describing the way it was looted and ransacked and how the king of Urartu committed suicide because of the destruction of the Muslim temple in that country. So this is not new, but we have governments that have the ability to destroy culture in ways that were not imaginable in the past, where they can monitor terrains, use theology, and completely flatten history. But I want to go back to the 15th century, which is when the Armenian Church, which was first headquartered in Etchmiadzin, in modern Republic of Armenia, had traveled because of invasions of Armenia. And in the early 15th century, it moved back to the Holy See, or See of Holy Etchmiadzin. Now this was an interesting time. Armenia was under Turkoman Karakoyunlu occupation, who were related to the ancestors of modern Azerbaijanis. And because of the political situation, Armenians were able to get political permission by the ruler at the time to move the Holy See back to Etchmiadzin. But what that meant is that the Ottoman Empire wanted to have its own control over Armenians. So soon we saw the Patriarchate in Constantinople or Istanbul established. The next big event is a record from the late 1600s, perhaps one of the largest maps made ever in the world, which documents 800 Armenian churches throughout the Ottoman and Persian or Safavid empires at the time. This is one of the few records we have of Armenian churches, but it still does not reflect the totality of the communities and sacred spaces that existed. In 1895, during the Hamidian massacres, which killed a few 100,000 Armenians, a lot of churches and monasteries were also were targeted. Johannes Lepsius has a list in an 1897 publication which summarizes reports by ambassadors and missionaries throughout the Ottoman Empire. So he counted about 2,500 villages or towns, Armenian inhabited, that were and destroyed. This is 1895. 568 churches, 328 converted churches, and looted, destroyed monasteries were 77. So monasteries were larger structures that had several churches, not just one individual church. So a huge list of heritage crime, which is a term used in certain parts of academia to describe state-sponsored or individual offenses against cultural properties, but a huge wave of heritage crime that happened during the Hamidian massacres. And this was part of attacking the civilians. So the buildings were not targeted on their own. They were part of attacking Armenians, and there are reports of that, including in the New York Times, in an article titled Another Armenian Holocaust in 1895, where the ransacking of several monasteries is specifically mentioned. Another report from the same era describes, and this is one of the less horrible descriptions of that, that's why I'm sharing with you, describes what was also described at the time in English language media as Holocaust. And it's talking about Turkish soldiers advising Armenians in Urfa, or my ancestral hometown, to seek refuge in the largest cathedral there, after which it was covered and, they basically converted it into a makeshift gas chamber, because they burned all around the entrances, and about 3,000 people. Here's a picture of the panorama of Urfa, and the largest building right here is a cathedral. Interestingly enough, despite the losses Armenians endured during the Armenian massacres, there was rebuilding. There is this striking image of people rebuilding the cathedral in Urfa. Imagine a place where most of the residents had been burned earlier alive, where people had the will to renovate and go back for weddings, for baptisms, to recreate their life. And this was a few decades before the Armenian Genocide. 4 years before the Armenian Genocide started, Maghakyan published a list of churches and Armenian communities throughout the Ottoman Empire. Probably hard to see, but he counted about 634 churches under the Patriarchate of Constantinople, 214 churches under the Catholic state of Cilicia or Kilikia. So we're talking about 2,000 church properties, most of which were targeted and destroyed throughout the years. And it's important to understand that churches were not just places of worship, places of ceremony like wedding or marriage. They were also places of learning. There were schools, there were print shops, there were about 500 Armenian newspapers throughout the Ottoman era. Here's an example of the print shop at Maghakyan. There are people in most of the photos preserved from that time period, including the monastery of Saint Bartholomew, and a picture taken about 100 years later. So I'm going to show some pictures of Ottoman Armenian culture, but also walk through the importance of those monuments for the people. Now sometimes, young people will take photos. I show it in the class, and I call it the hipster photo, because you can see they're trying to, have some cool poses there, and the guy in the middle is holding, I don't know, a baby goat. I assume greatest of time at the time, that didn't exist, but maybe for saw it. Now, Hulavang is known today to those who've been following the topic because of PBS, the documentary The Hidden Map by Ani Ovanesyan and Steven. It's one of the most looted Armenian churches, one of the most endangered one in Turkey, and I wanted to show that image. So after the Armenian church moved its headquarters back to Echmiadzin in the early 15th century, the Catholic state in Cilicia or Kilikia continued its administration over several hundred properties, now based in Lebanon, but you can see how large of a complex it was with the outer walls and the main monastery and administration in the center. Another photo of that, and just a few decades later, showing the near complete destruction, and a photo from 10 years ago that I took, and Professor Maghakyan had taken a similar photo. We were looking at it today. Just a few walls. Some other photos of Armenian monasteries throughout the Ottoman Empire and the destruction that happened right afterwards during the Armenian Genocide, starting in 1915. Another photo of Varakavang. This is from 1895. And the destruction that followed in 1915. A photo from Trapizon, where some Armenians went back in 1918 after the Ottomans were defeated over one, but there was temporary administration in Istanbul that allowed the return of Armenians. And so Armenians would go and see that sacred sites like this church were not only destroyed, but it had been used as the auction house for their own personal properties. There are some really good books for reference, including Confiscation and Destruction by two scholars. And there is a very interesting passage in one of them, written by a survivor, describing the moment she left her hometown. Most back for a last look at homes in which they had spent a lifetime rearing families, getting children and grandchildren, cultivating gardens and farms. All was now being left behind. The cattle, fowl, precious rugs, and silverware, mulberry trees, stores of food and drink. The uprooting was complete, the severing final, the destruction of life as we had known it. Home, church, school, wealth, neighbors, vineyards laden with fruit, fields ripening for the fall harvest was total. More images of destruction, this one from Adana. An image of Saint God of Mush, Sultan Surkarabet, which is the church we spoke about earlier, the most important shrine in Western Armenia, as Ottoman Armenians refer to the region. Another view of the same church, and a very important image that shows the immediate destruction that happened from 1916 of Surkarabet. Now, there are photos of this from the 1940s and 50s, and the state from those photos seems to be very similar from the original destruction. So for a period of a few decades, at least as far as this particular church is concerned, there was no further destruction. But those of you, I know Professor Barlow has been there, and maybe others who have been to Mush, there's only a few remnants remaining, and a lot of stones used in the local construction and homes. Another prominent cathedral or monastic complex is Khetskong, which was bombarded sometime in the 40s or 50s. And it shows today, photos show today, the survival of just one of the sites. Now, interestingly enough, the most famous painter of Soviet Armenia, Martyr Osarian, has this picture that he had done for a tomb by Hovhannes Tumanyan, the famous writer, that is showing a pilgrimage to Armenians at Khetskong, which was a very common scene in a lot of the churches and monasteries throughout Ottoman Armenia, where people would go spend time, and unfortunately their practice is largely lost today. There's very places where the pilgrimage tradition has continued. One of them is in Iran. The monastery of Saint Talos, yes, which is also a UNESCO intangible heritage site. So the act of going there and the self is World Heritage. So there's two recognitions of it internationally. Well, obviously, this is good for Iran's image, so they pushed for that. And then another picture of another important monastery in Mush. This is Saint Apostles, and also Saint Translators, because there used to be the famous graves of translators. We're going to look at the graves, but this is an image from earlier era by Reinhold Khacharian. But here we have an image of the translators of the Bible. So these are, the monuments are probably later era, but the actual tombs are from the 5th century, and they're showcasing important figures in Armenian history. This is a very famous photograph, and in there is a picture of the last monk of this monastery. It's a very interesting character. I was preparing this research, which is ongoing. I was able to find a better photograph of him, and also identify him. His name was Hovannes. And it was a very interesting character. He was very welcoming of guests who would go on pilgrimages, would write stories of meeting him, how kind he was, how funny he was. But he had done something odd. And then we pre-made a graveyard, a tombstone for himself. If you look at it, in Armenian, it has his name. He also notes there how he took care of the monastery as a father would of his children. So he did everything as best as he could. But the most striking thing on this is the date of his supposed death, which was never completed. 1/9. Because there was no one to bury him after he was beheaded. Now, this was discovered by a French researcher in the 70s, and it was publicized, but people who have gone back to the monastery have not seen the stone since. So it has been destroyed. I mention this because heritage is not about the property or buildings. It's all about the people. And if you're interested in learning more about private property was targeted and still continues to be targeted by the Republic of Turkey, I recommend this book by Maghakyan and the former Kazan visiting professor, Umit Kurt. I want to go back to the idea of people, the importance of the traditions of visiting sacred sites. And in our 4 lectures, we'll talk about how Armenian pilgrims have left a mark on some of the churches that are most vulnerable and threatened in the Republic of Turkey today. Now, the heritage and the festivals of the churches were not all about prayer, also dances and tightrope walking. So this were the life of the community in many ways. And interestingly enough, they were not only attended by Armenians. Remember the very photograph we looked at of a dance? Now there is another picture by the same photographer down by the same day, and they have identified some of the dancers as Kurdish. We know that Kurds have played several roles in the Armenian genocide as perpetrators, but also as writers. So in the next 2 lectures, we'll talk about the agency of all the stakeholders, the victims, the perpetrators, the bystanders, the looters, etc. It's important to end it on a positive note today and acknowledge some people, one person who's played a key role in saving Armenian monuments, and that's the Kurdish-Turkish writer Yaşar Kemal, who's credited with saving in 1951 Ahtamar or Surkhaç, probably one of the most famous parts of Armenian architecture we'll talk about in the next lecture. And I wanted to end on this note to open a conversation, if not today, but 2 weeks from today, on what can be done, since many people in the audience are of Ottoman Armenian heritage, what can be done in our engagement with the people who still live in those areas to at least ensure that what has remained of the sacredness, that those can be preserved for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Maghakyan. So I think what we're going to do is go ahead and open up for some questions and some discussion. I'm going to take the liberty as being the moderator here to ask the first question. So I think start off by talking about, this is more of a historical, the pre-Erdogan and also Ottoman period. And we saw a lot of pictures of the district churches. So could you broaden that picture a little bit and give some examples of any churches that were preserved, or what was the general policy? In other words, was it a universal policy of the Republic of Turkey, let's say 1923 until 1990? Was it to simply go out and systematically destroy, or was it also a case of simply neglect in some cases?
Okay, that's a great question, and it's a question that has not been fully explored by anyone.